Hey everybody, the Super Vader 400 here, the brown skinned human, and of course Douglas Blair Roberts coming back at you with another video. And as you can see by the title above, this is the intro video to various Dragon Ball Z rants. Like I've said in previous videos, there will be one intro video for a bunch of audio narration reviews, because in previous videos, in previous videos, I got sick of recording an intro for every audio audio narration, and I want to save more disk space on my hard drive. So this is what we're going to be doing from now on. So this tackles every Dragon Ball Z rant: the Piccolo saga, Saiyan saga, Namek and Frieza sagas, Android and Cell sagas, Babidi and Majin Buu base sagas, the entire Dragon Ball Super franchise, Fakatsu no F, the entire Dragon Ball Z franchise, the entire Dragon Ball franchise, and even though I like these versions of Dragon Ball, love these versions of Dragon Ball, um, Super Brawly, and of course maybe Dragon Ball Evolution. Because while I like those films, I do have a problem. I do have a couple of problems with those films. So this is the intro video to all Dragon Ball base rants. So with that being said, let's get started right now. Gonna show you what I'm made of. Sorry about that. Alright, it's time for part two of Doug's and my worst and most overrated video games of all time. Best to worst. Number one. Number one on this list, as you can see by the picture here, is one of my all-time favorite games, and that is the 2013 Killer Instinct remake, which is just titled Killer Instinct. Yeah, like I said, I had to put that nostalgia aside. Killer Instinct, the reboot. The reboot is number one. It is the best game of my worst and overrated video games. The problem with this video game right here, action, the storyline, action, cast of characters, and content of this video game was great. However, however, the gameplay style, the gameplay style and the lack of a real story mode in this video game makes it number one. This video game is also very, very dated. This video game, while it looks like a seventh and eighth generation video game, The video game itself is vastly similar to the video games, to the fighting games of the mid to late 90s, early to mid 2000s, which this video game is arcade style. If you see fighting games nowadays, they're cinematic. They're totally cinematic, whereas back then they were arcade, and later in the mid to late 2000s they were RPG style. This is some dated arcade video game similar to Street Fighter Alpha, the Third Strike, and the King of Fighter series. And the game engine is nothing like the original Killer Instinct. It's a cross between Street Fighter 4 and Mortal Kombat 2011. I think this video game is better than both of those. Gameplay wise, is better than both of those. Well, maybe not Street Fighter, but definitely better than Mortal Kombat 2011. And the video game is much slower than the original Killer Instinct, which that is a no-no. That is a complete departure from what Killer Instinct was totally about. The last problem I had with the video game was the storyline. While it was great, it was a reboot. I want to know what happened in Killer Instinct 2 after the group defeated Garganos. What happened after that battle? What happened after that battle? Instead, we'll never know. Because we got a reboot here. And I know that eventually you would have to reboot, but not so soon. Not so soon. Which brings me to the last reason why this video game is number one on my worst and overrated video games. This game, I had to track down an Xbox. I had to buy an Xbox One, which was hard to set up, and hard to find the right equipment to set it up. I had to track down an Xbox One just to play this video game right here. And even the people who made this game knew how terrible this game was, because as a bonus, they released the Killer Instinct special edition, deluxe edition. I keep forgetting what it was called anyway. This bundle contained the original Killer Instinct 1 and 2 from the arcade and Nintendo based consoles in the 90s. That's how you know they knew this game right here was terrible. But if they had released this on the 360, on the Xbox 360 and PS3, I would have forgave them. But no, they were so money hungry and wanted to badly sell copies for the overrated Xbox One, that they released this game as an Xbox One exclusive. It's one of the only exclusives on the Xbox One. The game feels, looks, and plays like a Xbox 360 game and a fighting game from the 90s and mid 2000s. So that's why Killer Instinct is number one. Like I said, I had to put that nostalgia aside. We're going from best to worst. Number two is Mortal Kombat 11, not 2011, 11, the most recent Mortal Kombat. This video game right here is one of the best looking one of the best looking video games of all time. The graphics, this is the best looking Mortal Kombat game of all time. It has loads and loads of content. However, while the reason this game is number two on my worst and most overrated video games list, because this video game is a huge problem I've had with the 7th and 8th generations, and it started in the 5th generation, and that was video games that look good but do not play good at all. And Mortal Kombat 11 is one of those. Mortal Kombat 11, first off, the fighting engine is a rehash of the last two, Mortal Kombat 9 and Mortal Kombat X, which Mortal Kombat X gameplay wise was the best. Why didn't they just reuse that for this engine? We reuse that same engine for this video game right here. For this video game right here, this video game plays like a slow, clunky, lethargic version of Killer Instinct, Injustice, Street Fighter, and like I said, the previous two Mortal Kombat. It doesn't play as good as it looks. Then the content, you have to go through several bogus and BS challenges. One of the many things I didn't like about the awesome 3D era, Deadly Alliance and Deception, one of the things I didn't like about those games was all the cool content in this game. You had to go through several complex, hard challenges to unlock. And here, you got to do that. You got to do that too. Then having unnecessary largest amount of content just to make more money, just to charge more, just to get more money out of you. This was also one of the biggest and one of the longest games. It took a long time to install. Then, if you don't update your console, if you don't update your console, your servers will be disconnected. So all the stuff with the exception of the character endings that you unlock, all the cool costumes and stuff, they will be disabled until you update your freaking console. Like I said, the best things about this game were the visuals, graphics, and story modes. Of the NetherRealm Mortal Kombat era, which I think storyline wise is terrible, this was the most exciting. This was the most exciting. You had two. You had the original 11. Then you had a much better update called Aftermath. So that's why Mortal Kombat 11 is Mortal Kombat 11 is number 2 on this list. Number 3 is the 2011 blockbuster Mortal Kombat 9. Mortal Kombat 9. I think this video game was an awesome PS3 Xbox 360 game. I, however, think this right here is the worst Mortal Kombat game of all time. The worst Mortal Kombat game of all time. Let's start off with the gameplay. The gameplay, just like 11, is a slow, lethargic version of Killer Instinct, Street Fighter 4, and Mortal Kombat vs. DC, restricted to a 2D plane. When this game released, the NetherRealm Studios promised some brand new, exciting gameplay, complex, exciting gameplay for experienced players. There was nothing new or complex about it. It was a rehash of the previous one, Mortal Kombat vs. DC, with with restricted to a 2D plane. It was nothing like the old school Mortal Kombat. Those games 1 through 4 were fast-paced, exciting action. This was slow, boring, and lethargic. The only thing in common with this game was the battle stages and several storylines from those games being featured here. Next was the storyline. This this video game had the worst storyline I've ever seen in not only a fighting game but video games in general. There were so many plot holes and so many inconsistencies and reckonings and changes from the original Mortal Kombat lore, which I pay attention to. I play for gameplay and storyline, both. I'll accept one without the other, such as I will accept gameplay with a weak or terrible storyline because after all, when it comes to video games, it's gameplay first. But this right here, the only good parts were the action and content. The storyline was absolutely terrible. And now, at the time, their graphics were phenomenal. Now their graphics are dated because if you look how updated the graphics look in the follow-ups, that's X and Mortal Kombat 11, you'll see how dated this is. Even though 11 features a time travel plot and features characters from this video game, they look vastly different from what everyone looked like in Mortal Kombat 9. That's how you can tell Mortal Kombat 9 is already dated visual wise. The battle stages and stuff look cool. The battle stages and the violence look cool, but the character designs and skins are absolutely terrible and dated by today's standards, and that's why Mortal Kombat 9 is number 3. Number 4 is Marvel vs. Capcom 3. This is a pretty decent. This is a pretty decent to good game, but it's dated. It's dated. All they did was take the Marvel vs. Capcom franchise, put some 3D on it, put some 3D HD DVD graphics on it, and call it a day. No interactive cool story mode, which they would add in the next one for, but they know that should have been here in Marvel vs. Capcom 3. So once again, this video game was a mid to late 90s, early to mid 2000s style video game in the 2010s. And they had released it for 6th generation consoles, PS3, Xbox, or PS2, Xbox, the original Xbox, and those systems, or the Wii. I would have forgave, or the 7th generation console known as the Wii. I would have forgave them. But no, this was a big budget PS3 and Xbox 360 game. 360 game. So that's why Marvel vs. Capcom 3 is number 4, my worst and most overrated fight games. 5 is five is I gotta put that sixth generation PS2 nostalgia aside, and that is Capcom Fighting Evolution. Capcom Fighting Evolution. Capcom Fighting Evolution. Now this video game does have an excuse for sucking so bad. Capcom Fighting Evolution is a pretty okay game. It's still one of my favorite games despite how terrible it is. But and gameplay wise is okay, but my problem with this video game right here, just because SNK Playmore withdrew from the fighting game genre to focus exclusively on King of Fighters and other games like Metal Gear, not Metal Gear, but Metal Slug, etc. That did not give Capcom the excuse to be downright lazy. They had the potential to make one of the biggest Capcom storyline games of all time, featuring your characters. But instead, you just made a simple mid to late 90s, early 2000s beat 'em up. Early 2000s beat 'em up in the mid 2000s, while other games at the time like Mortal Kombat, the Naruto video game series, and even Tekken have cinematic RPG like story modes, and here you busting, and here you just being a lame, dated late 90s, early 2000s style of video game. So that's the problem I have with Capcom Fighting Evolution. Capcom Fighting Evolution, still a fun game. Still a fun game to play. Its pros, well, gameplay engine is the same as Capcom versus SNK Part 1 and 2. So if you enjoyed SNK, you would enjoy this. SNK and Street Fighter 3, you would enjoy this video game right here. And it gave us the powerful character, the schoolgirl Ingrid, and it had Pyron, the main antagonist of Darkstalkers, as a boss. So those were pros. Six was the PlayStation 3 exclusive Infamous Part 1 and 2. Part 1 and 2. This game right here is one of the best PlayStation 3 exclusives, but when you compare it to other action action based games and video games in general, it's just average and okay. It's just average and okay, especially when you compare it to its rival, um, Prototype. And this video game is now dated. It has mediocre, average gameplay, terrible, terrible, terrible graphics and visuals. And now I understand games like this. This is an open world action game, so games like this have to sacrifice graphics in order to have the really in-depth gameplay. But their gameplay really isn't all that in depth. It really isn't all that in depth. So if you sacrifice graphics, then your gameplay has to be good. But if your gameplay is average and your graphics are average, that's not good too. Its rival Prototype, which looks like a PS2 Xbox game, original PS2 and Xbox game, plays so much better. They had to sacrifice graphics for its for its really awesome gameplay. So that's why Infamous is on this list. It's just dated. It was great when it came out, but now it's just dated and terrible, and it's inferior compared to its rival Prototype 1 and 2. 7 is the WWE SmackDown vs. Raw games, 2008 and 2009. Both of these games, they fall in the same category as Mortal Kombat 11. These were two of the first games to look to when you watch their trailers. Their trailers look really, really good. But when you played these games, they were some of the worst. They were some of the worst. They were some of the slowest and worst games. Games. They were slow, lethargic, and boring, kind of like the action on television. The only things good about these games were their content. These two games right here, SmackDown vs. Raw 08 and 09, were absolutely terrible, and some of the worst wrestling and fighting games of all time are these games. 8 is the similar titled UFC Undisputed series. The story modes cast of characters and content is great, but the gameplay is slow and lethargic, and the same engine as the SmackDown versus Raw video games. I like the old UFC and MMA video games from the late '90s and early to mid 2000s. I even thought the EA Sports UFC, which got a mixed negative reception, was better than this right here. So yes, UFC Undisputed. 9. Metal Gear Solid 4. Guns of the Patriot. You know this game was going to appear on the list. This game right here is one of the worst games of all time. It's a stealth action based game. It has little action. It has little gameplay action. Super long cutscenes. Super long cutscenes. And now in the late 2010s, the late 2010s has some of the worst graphics and some of the worst graphics and visuals I've ever seen. One of the worst looking games I've ever seen. It's already its game visual wise is already dated. So yeah, Metal Gear Solid 4, Guns of the Patriot. Just about any game is better than this. I wish, and in my opinion, Metal Gear Solid 4 is one of the worst games of all time. I wish I could say it was the worst, but it's not the worst. There are games that are way worse than this. Number 10 is Thor, God of Number 10 is Thor, God of Thunder. Yeah, now we get to the superhero games. 10 is Thor, God of Thunder. Horror. The Thor the Thor movies are phenomenal, but the video game was terrible. This is a crappy, broken, terrible version of God of War. Poor man's God of War is this video game right here. 11. The Iron Man games. Iron Man 1 and 2. Iron Man 1 and 2. Both this and Thor took something that could have been good. You got Iron Man and Thor, two of the most powerful characters in the Marvel mythos and in comic books generals, and you managed to screw it up. This video game was Iron Man 2. You can't describe how terrible Iron Man was. The controls sucks, and the gameplay is just terrible too. So yeah, 12 is the fighting game from the '90s, Justice League Task Force. Injustice completely redeemed, completely improved and redeemed itself from this game. But this game right here, the Justice League beat 'em up from the '90s, was absolutely terrible. It was a terrible, slow, clunky, lethargic version of Street Fighter 2, which Street Fighter 2 is still to this day way more exciting and way more fun to play than this game right here. 13 is muscles. Tag team muscles. Mediocre gameplay and even worser character sprites. Visuals were okay, but the even worser character sprites, even for that era, as you can see, the NES era, even for that era. Alright, before we get to the last and worst game on this list, now we get to some honorable mentions. Video games in this list had a bunch of redeemable qualities, which is why they're in the honorable mentions and not on the worst and most overrated games. But yet they've done things to earn a spot on this list, and that was number 1, Mortal Kombat X. This gameplay wise was the best Mortal Kombat of the NetherRealm Studios era. Modernized version of it was an awesome modernized version of Mortal Kombat 4, Injustice, Killer Instinct, Street Fighter 4, and a much better version gameplay engine wise and graphic wise than its previous game, Mortal Kombat 2011. And the store and the action and content and cast of characters was on point. However, what makes this game number 1 honorable mentions, this video game had the worst storyline I've ever seen. It was even worse than Mortal Kombat 9, Mortal Kombat 2011. This had the worst, most boring story mode ever. I was so happy when this story mode was over. And then I didn't even get what I wanted from the story mode. All I got was I unlocked it, the Elder God Shinnok. Then missing characters who should be in the game, not being featured in this game right here. And just like returning from two of the things I didn't like about Deadly Alliance and Deception, returning from those games, super hard to unlock content. So that's why Mortal Kombat X is number one, despite being the best Mortal Kombat of the NetherRealm era. Number two, number two, pretty much number two through five are Dragon Ball Z games, and number two is Dragon Ball Z Raging Blast, just a complete remix and reprint of Dragon Ball Z Budokai Tenkaichi. Same vision, same gameplay with improvised HD DVD visuals, visuals, no changes whatsoever. Still the same battle stages, the same everything from Dragon Ball Z. Yeah. However, it's way better than any game on this list, which is why it's here in the honorable mentions. Three is Xenoverse. This is one of the coolest and best looking Dragon Ball Z games in a long time, but I think the gameplay style is some of the worst I've ever seen in a video game. It's some kind of arcade space battle Super Smash Brothers style of gameplay. And it's a horrible mixture of what I just said. 4, Battle of Z is the same thing as Xenoforce. Battle Z, like I said, one of the best looking Dragon Ball games in a long time, but it has that same terrible gameplay. And of course, it's based upon the Battle of Gods movie, which is okay, but I hated and didn't like. So yeah. 5. Dragon Ball GT Final Bout. The only thing cool about this was its rarity. This was an okay game, but it was a slow, lethargic version of Tekken 2 and all the 3D games that existed at the time. The only thing cool was its rarity. But once better Dragon Ball games were made and released, yeah, this game began to show its age. But it's here in the honorable mentions because of I remember how epic this. I remember how hard to find, how epic and rare this game was in the early 2000s. 6 is War. 6 is the PlayStation and N64 games and Mortal Kombat 4 prototype game War Gods. This game's storyline and lore wise was pretty cool, but the gameplay and the graphics were pretty cool for their time, but the gameplay itself was clunky. One of the coolest, best worst games was War Gods, but it led to something cool. It was the prototype for Mortal Kombat 4. They used this as a blueprint to see what they had to make with Mortal Kombat 4, which is Mortal Kombat 4 is one of the best fighters and one of the best Mortal Kombat games of all time. So I owe this game for that. But yeah, War Gods. Like I said, have to put that nostalgia aside. Even games I like will make this list. 7 is Paper Mario. Paper 7 is Paper Mario. In my opinion, even as a kid, I thought this was a dumb idea. The game itself is just okay, but I thought an idea of Mario, a video game with a Paper Mario made of paper, was the stupidest and dumbest idea of all time. 8 um 8 is the original Virtua Fighter for the Sega Saturn. The Sega Saturn, like I said, the fifth generation started this whole video games that look good but play terribly. And this video game plays poorly and looks dated and terrible. Terrible too. This game represents every problem I had with the Sega Saturn and Sega after the Sega Genesis, focusing way more on graphics and enhancements instead of and various system enhancements instead of video games. And that's why, and it's because of my opinion BS decisions like that why Sega is no longer in the video game console war anymore. 9 is the original Street Fighter 1987, the arcade and NES video game. Love this video game, especially when it comes to the storyline and lore, and it's still fun to play. But this video game was clunky and lethargic. Street Fighter 2 and the sequels and every fighting game after this vastly improved over this video game right here. 10 10. This wasn't gonna be on the list, but I had to put it on here, and that is the arcade classic Pit Fighter. This video game dominated arcades before Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat arrived. Um, this video game right here is one of the coolest games of all time. It's a beat 'em up arena style game packaged as a fighter, and it's really cool. But it doesn't have a lot of moves. It doesn't have a lot of moves when it's supposed to be an in-depth fighter, and the collision detection and combat is absolutely fake. They barely make contact. Other video games like this, such as the Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter games and all the other fighting games, the action and the violence and stuff look extremely realistic. Here, it doesn't. But Pit Fighter is one of the greatest games ever. That's why this and Street Fighter are honorable mentions on this list. And 14, the worst video game of all time was Superman 64. You take one of the coolest ideas ever, a beat 'em up starring Superman, the first and most powerful superhero of all time, and you screw it up and make it extremely complicated, including one terrible lesson of you going through giant rings, level of you going through giant rings with terrible graphics, animations, and just like I said, one of the worst one of the worst video games of all time, widely considered the worst video game of all time. I like to make jokes and say I'd rather play this than some of the other games you heard on this list. No, every game on this list is automatically better than Superman 64. Nothing is as bad as Superman 64. Make no mistake about it. Yeah, so these were the worst and most overrated video games of all time. Like I said earlier in this video, I had to put that nostalgia aside. If you watch my previous one, which the link to my previous video from 2000, I think it was 13, that will be my previous worst video games list. That will be on this list. That had that list contained none of my favorite video games. None of my favorite video games on that list. On that list, this one contained several of my favorite video games. So with that being said, I'm finished. You want to hear the rest of the music? Turn the video off right now.